What is your topic?
Al Capone.
Excellent. Sarah, John, Isaiah, are you ready?
Yes, sir.
And proceed.
Back in 1899, on January 17th, one of the greatest gangsters of all time was born. His name was Alphonsus Gabriel Capone, or better known by his Americanized name, Al Capone. Al Capone once said, "You can go a long way with a smile, but you can go even farther with a smile and a gun." Now this statement right here, I feel like tells a lot about who he was. But today we're going to take a closer look at his early life growing up, the life he led to Chicago, the gangs that came before him in Chicago, the power he once held, and the later years of Al Capone. Al was born to two immigrant parents, Gabriel and Teresina Capone, and they immigrated back in 1894 from Naples, Italy to Brooklyn, New York. According to University of Michigan, they had 42,977 Italian immigrants that year. In total, they had 9 kids. Al was the 4th child. He was the first one that was actually born in Brooklyn. And all 9 of the kids actually grew up to be involved in some sort of criminal activity and in some sort of gang. Al was definitely the one growing up that showed the most interest in those types of things. He was even a part of 2 kid gangs growing up. The first of which was the Brooklyn Pipers, and the second was the 40 Thieves Juniors. Now what I mean by kid gangs is basically they just rivaled against other gangs within their neighborhood and did petty little crimes such as stealing cigarettes. And the gangs consisted of kids that he rounded up from school. He went to a public school in Brooklyn, and he went up until the 6th grade. Now, once he got to the 6th grade, he was expelled because he physically assaulted a teacher after the teacher called him out. And with immigrant families, they generally stopped going to school after the 6th grade because immigrant families were poor and weren't considered successful in society. So his older brothers actually quit going to school after the 6th grade as well, but being expelled gave him more of an incentive to leave and go work. So once he left school, he did many odd jobs. He worked at restaurants and such. And finally, before the age of even 18, he landed a job as a bouncer in a bar owned by Frankie Yale. Frankie Yale was also a gangster and involved in many things like that. So he got to kind of know the ways of the criminal world by knowing him. And Frankie Yale was a part of the 5 Points gang, and the 5 Points gang was headed up by Johnny Torrio. So by knowing Johnny Torrio and working with Yale, that's kind of how he got his major start into his career. Eventually he moved on from being a bouncer to a bartender. And one night when he was working as a bartender, he got his notorious nickname Scarface because he insulted a female, and the brother of the female got very angry at him and started a bar fight, taking a razor to the left side of his face. And now the next year, when he was just 19 years old, he went to a dance and met his wife, Mary, or May, Coughlin. They had a son, Albert, nicknamed Sonny Capone, and the following year after he was born, they got married. So by working with Yale and Torrio, he did many odd jobs for them and did a lot of their dirty work. And some of that dirty work included murder. And now just before the 1920s, he was avoiding a murder charge, and they thought that the best way for him to avoid that murder charge would be for him to flee to Chicago to meet up with Torrio, which is where Torrio was currently working at the time, leading up the 5 Points gang. So he took his son and wife and went to Chicago, and the year that he left was actually the year that the law of prohibiting the making, sales, and transportation of liquor was put into place, the law of prohibition. And that was kind of the start of the early 1920s, and that was the start of the lawless city and how Chicago got its nickname. So once he got to Chicago, he joined up with Torrio and the 5 Points gang. He slowly worked his way up the ranks with the 5 Points gang and became Torrio's top assistant in that. And Torrio was finally arrested for a short 9-month sentence with multiple charges. Now within just that short time, Capone was able to take over the 5 Points gang and make that his gang. He took over the bootlegging industry and greatly expanded it in just a short period of time. According to John Simpkins, when he took over the bootlegging industry, he very quickly established many illegal drinking establishments, and which in the first couple of years he had 161 of them. He very openly said how he made his money. He didn't have a problem with telling people that. He once said, "I make money by supplying a public demand. If I break the law, my customers, some of the best people in Chicago, are as guilty as me."
Now you can't talk about Al Capone without mentioning the history of Chicago and why a man like Al Capone would want to go to Chicago in the first place. According to the World Book Encyclopedia, an article of Chicago in 2007, Chicago is here located in northern Illinois, right on Lake Michigan. Now, many Native American groups roamed this area for thousands and thousands of years, but in the 1600s, the Native American group called the Potawatomi settled here, and in 1673, the first white immigrants settled here. They were French Canadians trying to find a quicker way up to Canada. Now, from then up until the War of 1812, Chicago eventually grew and grew more because of these French Canadians and even more immigrants coming to Chicago. Now, during the War of 1812, there was a lot of violence in Chicago, and Chicago actually became completely unsettled for 4 years. But because of the Illinois and Michigan Canal, which was a canal that went straight through Chicago into the Lake Michigan, the town prospered. It was easier to transport goods and brought in more immigrants, and their economy boomed because of lumbering. Chicago is known as the world's lumbering capital. It was their main source of industry. And I think you know where I'm going with this, the Great Chicago Fire, and I think you guys have all heard the legend of the old cow kicking over the lantern and starting the whole place on fire, which could be true, not really sure, but Chicago did burn down, and 90% of Chicago was left completely homeless, and millions of dollars were left. But Chicago, like it did after the War of 1812, bounced right back up and had another economic surge. According to National Gang Center's History of Street Gangs in the United States in 2010, after the Great Chicago Fire, like I said, Chicago bounced back up through industries like meat packing or just typical factories or textiles, things of that sort. And many immigrants from Scandinavian countries and most of Europe actually immigrated here to Chicago. And Chicago at the time around the 1860s was 80% foreign born, which led to tons of disorganization in the city and many gangs in the city. These gangs were typically their own ethnicity kind of going against each other, and this is kind of why Johnny Torrio came here. And the most populous groups was the Irish and Polish and the Italian gangs. Now, the gangs rose, like I said, because of many gang members, and there was over 1,300 gangs in Chicago at the time of Johnny Torrio. Now, according to Demography and Encyclopedia of Chicago in 2015, Al Capone decided to come here, which you can only imagine. Why would a gangster-like man like Al Capone, he would love to come to a town like Chicago with 1,300 gangs, and it's perfectly set up for him. Now I'll turn it over to Isaiah to talk about the life of Al Capone.
So Capone was number 2 in Chicago right now. Torrio was still over him, but he still did a lot of things by himself. And one of those things was Cicero. He saw this wealthy suburb of Chicago. There's a lot of money there, so he decided he wanted to make it his. So on election day, he takes 700 armed thugs, and he convinces people to vote for his friends. And there's a lot of shooting during this day and stuff, but afterwards, he was getting $100,000 weekly income, and he was paying $30,000 in hush money a week. And this was because all the people who they got voted to his office, and they did what he said. In one instance, the mayor, Capone pushed him down the steps of the city stairs and kicked him for a while and was beating him. And the police officer across the street just walked away. That's how much corruption was in Cicero. But the people of Cicero still loved Capone. He was great. He was great in liquor. And this is all according to the 1974 book by Mary Letts, Al Capone. And the one critic in Cicero is Robert St. John. He owned the Cicero Tribune, and he printed bad stuff about Capone. So Capone put a couple bullets in him, and then he forged his signature and bought the company for himself. And this is how Capone operated. And Capone, he was making a lot of money, so he had some rivals who wanted to get in the bootleg industry as well. Spike O'Donnell was one of the first ones. He was more of an old-style gangster. He didn't last long. It was pretty easy to kill him for Capone. Dean O'Bannon, he took over the gang next. He was a florist by day, gangster by night. So one of Capone's friends, Mike Merlo, died. He was the president of the Chicago Mafia, or the Union Siciliana. And he was throwing a big funeral like this. And so he ordered $100,000 from Dean O'Bannon. And when he went to pick him up, he and a couple of his friends shot down Dean O'Bannon, killed him. And this is Dean O'Bannon's funerals. They threw the biggest funerals at these Chicago funerals, like gang funerals. Jaime Weiss took over next. He was kind of a psychopath. No one really liked him. He liked to kill people a lot. And he took 7 cars, filled them with gunmen, and he drove them past Capone and Torrio, firing the whole way. No one got hurt except for some old lady, but this made Torrio flee Chicago. He went back to Italy after this. And then the Jenna brothers, they did take over this gang. They were the Union Siciliana, so like the Chicago Mafia kind of. And they did this thing called alky cooking. They take people from Sicily, bring them to America for free, pay them to live in an apartment as long as they work the distiller, which is a dangerous job, but it made them lots of alcohol. And nobody was ever killed except outlaws, and the community is better without them. Capone, year unknown. So, William McSwiggan, he was the first police officer killed, because before this, it was only outlaws getting killed. Nobody cared if they killed other outlaws. They weren't killing them. They were just bringing liquor. The people were actually okay with the gangs. And at this point, he was making $2 million weekly, so a step up from $100,000. And so McSwiggan, he was a shady guy. He wasn't a great police officer. He was hanging around with some other gangsters. He was paid off. Wrong place, wrong time. He gets gunned down when they're trying to kill some other people. But it changed the public view of Capone. And Capone's response was, I paid McSwiggan and I paid him plenty, and I got what I was paying for. So they couldn't have ever prove that Capone killed him, but they all knew it was him, but they couldn't prove it in court, so he got away with this, and it angered the police kind of. So then the Allele gang, it took over the Irish gang, some of the Italian gangs, some Poles. It was an anti-Capone gang. They hired tons of hitmen to kill Capone. And one day, Joseph Allele, the president, he was taken for questioning. So Capone, he got his guys and he surrounded the detective bureau, the police building, these gangsters. The media loved this, they had a heyday. And after this, the government realized, oh, we should not be letting this happen. This is a disgrace. And Allele, he fled to Chicago, got killed a while later. And after this, Capone, he bought a house in Palm Island because police were coming after him a little more, so he could order a hit and move to Palm Island for a couple weeks. The hit would be carried out, and he'd come back and he'd have an alibi, so he got away with everything. And like the height of Capone's power, he was holding these robber barons councils. He'd get together with other gangsters. He'd say, oh, we're going to sell alcohol for this much. You sell here. He had operations in New Orleans, Florida, Bermuda, New York, Cuba. And he was hosting dinners with Mussolini's top officials. And Mayor Thompson Hale was president at this time. He was a total idiot, but he was against prohibition, so Capone, he put him in power. And he was also very generous. He opened soup kitchens. He gave lots of money as tips to everyone. And then the Valentine's Day Massacre. Frank Yale, his old boss, like Sarah said, was hijacking his liquor shipments to New York. So he killed Antonio Lombardo, who Capone put in power for the Union Siciliana a while back. And so Capone, he just whatever, he killed Frank Yale, put another guy in charge in the place of Antonio Lombardo. And Bugs Moran killed that guy. So he's like, you know what, I'm sick of this. So 7 of Moran's gang, they get a tip. They're like, where they can pick up some cheap liquor. So they go, 7 police officers come, and they shoot them all down. People think it's Capone. It probably was Capone, but there's also people that say it was the police, dressed like, because they're fed up with the violence too. They just decided to kill him without the law. But it's most likely Capone, and after this, everyone's outraged at Capone. No one really liked him anymore. So after this, people were trying to get him. They were trying to arrest him for anything. They arrested him for carrying weapons for a year. He served this. He was trying to lay low at the time. Elliot Ness was from Washington. They sent him, FBI guy, to get him. And I think he eventually caught him for tax evasion. The Great Depression happened, and he was making less money now than he was before. Chicago launched an anti-corruption campaign, but it didn't really do much. The names changed, but the game stayed the same. He still paid off the new people. And eventually he got caught for tax evasion, 11-year sentence and $2,072 in fines. They can't collect legal tax from illegal money, Capone. And he, in court, he didn't really try to defend himself. He thought he was going to get 3 years at most because of tax evasion. But he ended up getting 11 years, and that made him angry. That's according to the Al Capone, the FBI website.
So according to Alcatraz history, once he was imprisoned, he started out in Atlanta, Georgia at their federal prison, but was thought of as having special treatment and bribing the guards and just being Al Capone, getting his way. So they moved him to Alcatraz in San Francisco, California. And Alcatraz is a high security prison, and it's actually on the coast of San Francisco. It's kind of a small island. And he served his time there, and the last year that he was serving in prison, he was actually hospitalized because he was diagnosed with syphilitic dementia. So once he was released from the hospital, he was placed in Terminal Island, which is a federal correctional institution, and that was also in California. And he was released from there on November 16th of 1939. The rest of his life was pretty quiet. He lived in Palm Island, Florida with his wife, May, and finally on January 21st of 1947, he had a stroke. And from there on out, the last few days of his life, he spent hospitalized. He ultimately died of pneumonia on January 25th of 1947, and according to my Al Capone Museum, the doctor of Al Capone said he remains placed in the hands of Philbrook Funeral Homes, where his body remained in state until night of January 29th, whereupon he was removed to Chicago by hearse. So he's buried in South Chicago at Mount Olivet, and a few years later was moved to West Chicago at Mount Carmel, which is where his dad and brother were buried, and that is where his body currently remains.
You would think after Al Capone left Chicago that the crime rate and the murder rate would drop substantially, but if you think that, you're completely wrong. Many of the gangs today, like you see here in this map, actually existed at the time of Al Capone. And Al Capone's gang actually still exists today and has only had a couple other bosses since Al Capone. And according to Chicago Outfit and by the American Mafia History in 2012, during 1910 through 1930, there was over 1 million African Americans and Mexicans that fled the South due to the Jim Crow laws, and Chicago was kind of a hotspot for these places. Now, the number of African Americans in Chicago increased, which increased the gang numbers. Now, today, as you can see, Los Angeles, this is for murder rate. Los Angeles is a big number, Chicago is very dark red, and same with New York City, which is a little speck right here. But New York, the murder rate in Chicago is 4 times higher than New York City, even though it's 1/3 the size of New York City. And the murder rate in Chicago is actually 2 times higher than Los Angeles, even though it's half the size. Many gangs in Chicago are known as, they have super gang, which is 1,000+ members in one gang. There is over 100,000 gang members in Chicago compared to only 12,000 policemen. So the number is completely disproportionate and still has a great effect on the community. There's actually more people killed, there were more people killed in Chicago in 2012 than there were US soldiers in Afghanistan. And this is all according to Chicago Gang Violence by the Numbers, ABC News in 2012. And I'll turn it over to Isaiah to conclude about the legend of Al Capone.
So Capone, he was born as a poor boy in New York, grew up in the slums, true definition of the American dream. That Chicago was ready for a gangster to come along. It was a perfect spot. He did a lot of bad things and a lot of good things during his life. He ended up getting caught for something stupid, and his effects keep going until this day. All in all, I would say he is a legend.
Thank you.